Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming along to our presentation. As mentioned, my name's Nina. I work as a postdoctoral research fellow at Swinburne University of Technology in Melbourne, and presenting with me today is my colleague, Dr. Ben Spivak, who's a lecturer also at Swinburne University. And today we're going to share some of the key findings arising from our recent meta-analysis, which sought to kind of bring together the best available research evidence, looking at the effectiveness of psychological treatments for adult violent offenders across both correctional and forensic mental health settings. I was feeling particularly encouraged this morning, having attended Professor Wilson's talk. Our meta-analysis kind of has taken us the better part of 2 years. However, he mentioned today that he's part of some meta-analytic work that's been going on since the 80s. So feeling more productive and hopeful. So just by way of background, so this research was prepared as part of Catalyst, which is a consortium for research excellence that was established in 2017 under the auspices of Swinburne University. And we received initial funding from a ministerial grant from Corrections Victoria and also the Victorian Institute of Forensic Mental Health, or what's commonly known as Forensicare. So again, just some context. The overall goal of Catalyst is to kind of bring together both national and international partnerships that are kind of committed to preventing serious criminal behaviour. So with a particular emphasis on persistent violence and sexual offending. So really focusing on that kind of pointy end of crime. Some of our partners already include corrective services agencies, forensic mental health services, non-government organisations, and researchers and clinicians. And really the aim is to kind of improve community safety by better understanding, I guess, the causes of violence and sexual offending and learning how to intervene more effectively. So just really briefly, the consortium has these 3 kind of areas of focus: understanding and assessment, prevention and intervention, and desistance and reintegration. And you can see that kind of surrounding those main areas of focus are these substantive themes, which have been and will continue to kind of inform the nature of the work that's undertaken. So we've got a number of projects and initiatives currently underway, aside from the data we'll be presenting today. This includes, for example, commencing a prospective analysis of serious violent and sexual offenders on post-sentence orders in Victoria, designing intervention programs for high-risk and complex offenders, as well as kind of training packages for staff that work with those groups, as well as kind of implementing and evaluating a suite of dynamic risk assessment tools. We did bring with us some Catalyst information packs. If anyone feels like learning a little bit more about what we do or how to become involved, more than happy to have a bit of a chat about that. But moving on to, I guess, the focus of today's presentation, I guess as a starting point, and as Suzanne mentioned in her presentation, we really do currently have a fairly limited evidence base from which to draw any kind of definitive conclusions around how best to intervene with serious violent offenders. If we compare that to the sex offender treatment literature, where there's a number of reviews and meta-analyses exploring the effectiveness of treatment with this subgroup, to date there's been only one meta-analysis looking specifically at treatment effectiveness with adult violent offenders. You might be aware of this review. It was conducted by Jolliffe and Farrington in 2007, and they included 11 studies, 8 of which measured the effects of treatment specifically on violent recidivism. Of those 8 studies, 2 found statistically significant positive treatment effects, 4 reported reductions in violent reoffending that were not statistically significant, and then the final 2 actually reported increases in violent reoffending among those receiving the intervention. So collectively, this resulted in an overall reduction in violent recidivism of about 8 percentage points for the offenders receiving the interventions, which is reasonably promising. Now, this particular review excluded studies involving violent offenders with personality disorders or other mental health disorders, which I guess is interesting given that we know these people are not only overrepresented in violent offender populations, but they're also they also share a lot of the same kind of criminogenic risk factors and therefore treatment needs as offenders without those mental health issues. So we effectively sought to kind of update and extend that Jolliffe-Farrington review by including studies published over the last decade, but also by focusing on evaluations of violent offender treatments across both correctional and forensic mental health settings. And we had these three kind of research questions in mind. So number one, are psychological treatments with violent offenders in correctional and forensic mental health settings effective in reducing both institutional misconducts, which hadn't kind of been looked at yet, and of course community recidivism. Second, we were interested to know what factors might moderate the efficacy of those interventions, so looking specifically at methodological features, sample characteristics, and treatment variables as potential moderators. And third, I guess recognising that initial question doesn't tell us much or anything about the potential mechanisms underlying any behavioural change, we were keen to see whether these violent offender treatments affect change in more intermediary treatment targets or those kind of change levers that was mentioned earlier. So we looked specifically at things like trade anger or anger regulation, impulsivity, antisocial cognitions, problem solving and general social skills. Just briefly, studies were eligible to be included in our review if they evaluated the effects of a psychological intervention in a sample of adult violent offenders and relative to a comparable control condition. So a group of untreated violent offenders who were similar enough to the treated group, and we had some kind of criteria around that. So the primary outcomes of interest were violent and general community recidivism, as well as violent and general institutional misconducts. And then those secondary outcomes were those more kind of intermediary treatment targets that I just mentioned earlier. And those were typically measured, using a host of kind of self-report or observer-rated tools. In terms of study setting, as I mentioned, we were interested in both studies undertaken in correctional environments, so violent offenders receiving treatments either in prison or in a community setting, say those under kind of community corrections orders and so forth, but also studies undertaken within forensic mental health settings, so violent offenders with mental health disorders who were receiving these kind of violence interventions either on an inpatient or outpatient basis. So to identify studies for inclusion in our review, we conducted a fairly kind of comprehensive search of the literature, ranging from standard electronic database searching through to making contact with a number of leading experts in this area to see what might be kind of ongoing or unpublished. We had at least 2 independent reviewers involved at each stage of the review to ensure that we were minimising any kind of biases that we were introducing into the review process, and each study had its kind of methodological quality rated according to the Maryland Scientific Method Scale, which is a 3-point scale that effectively kind of quantifies the level of comparability between the treatment and control groups, and also using the gold standard kind of Cochrane domain-based assessment for bias. Just really quickly, so this just shows the flow of studies from identification through to inclusion in our review, and you can see that from about 13,000 records initially identified and screened, we included 24 studies in our meta-analyses of the primary outcomes and 18 studies in our meta-analyses of the secondary outcomes. So I'll just hand you over to Ben.
Okay, fantastic. Anyone here? Hello? Is that coming through?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm just going to talk. Let's start with the descriptive data for our behavioural outcomes. Now, just a note before I get into the data, I'm going to forego a lot of the technical detail just because of time reasons. But if you want more detail, there's a published manuscript on the way, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So of the 27 independent studies we included, 20 studies measured recidivism outcomes, by which we mean reconvictions, and 9 studies measured institutional misconduct. Total sample was quite large, just over 7,000 violent offenders across all the studies, and the average age was around early 30s. Now, despite the inclusion criteria, which was quite restrictive, we did find quite a bit of variation in terms of treatment characteristics. So average treatment length ranged from 15 minutes up to 470 hours, which is quite considerable. And we had all sorts of types of interventions. So intensive multimodal CBT, which was CBT that focused on a number of different modules related to violent offending, and that tended to be over 75 hours, well, was over 75 hours in length. Standard CBT, anger management, third wave CBT, which are things like schema-focused therapy and dialectical behavioural therapy, and motivational interviewing. Okay, now here are the results of our meta-analysis, and before you see 2 forest plots. Now the forest plots show the effect size associated with each study, and you can see a middle line here. The middle line is no effect. To the left of the middle line, the effect is in favour of treatment, and to the right, the effect is in favour of the control group. Now the effect size we chose was odds ratios, so where an effect size is to the left, it suggests lower odds of reoffending in the treatment group proportionally. Now that's not necessarily intuitive to understand, so where we provide those results, we've converted them to a phi coefficient to an R, which provides us with the absolute percentage difference between groups. So the pooled effect for violent recidivism was significant at the 0.05 level, and we find an average difference in the percent reconvicted of about 10%. So that's an absolute difference. So let's say we have 50% of the control group reoffending. That means that 40% approximately in our treatment group are reoffending. So an absolute drop of 10 percentage points. And then for general non-violent recidivism, we find fairly similar results. So treatment, again, was significant, the pooled effect, with an average difference of about 11% between the groups. Okay. Now, with institutional misconduct, the studies presented frequencies rather than proportions, so we had to use a different effect size, which was Hedges G, and that expresses the difference between 2 groups in standard deviation units. Once again, effects to the left of the middle line are effects in favour of treatment, and effects to the right of the line are effects in favour of control. Now there's 2 things you'll notice about these forest plots. The first is that we have a considerable lack of studies relative to our recidivism outcomes. And the second is in relation to the first forest plot, which relates to non-violent institutional misconduct. The effect is extremely varied. So it moves quite a bit between being in favour of control to being in favour of treatment. Now, so probably comes as no surprise that treatment's not significant, probably for 2 reasons here. One is the lack of studies, and 2 is the variability in effect. So ultimately, in terms of saying something interesting about institutional misconduct, we require more, basically higher numbers of high-quality studies in order to say anything definitive. At the moment, it awaits those results. Okay, so overall, the meta-analysis of primary outcomes suggests that treatment's associated with a reduction in the proportion of people who are subsequently convicted of an offence. And there are a number of questions that arise in relation to the finding. So the first question is, what methodological characteristics are associated with effective treatment? So do RCT-based trials, are they associated with a lower effect compared to matched groups? Is treatment more effective for certain populations? So, for instance, prisoners versus those in forensic mental health settings, or various cultural groups. And finally, the third question is, what are the psychological mechanisms driving the treatment effect? the treatment targets that Nina spoke of earlier, do they vary in the same way as the outcomes that we're ultimately interested in, which are recidivism and misconduct? Okay, so getting to the first question, methodology factors. Consistent with Jolliffe and Farrington, we found higher estimates for studies that were probably slightly more biased or questionable. So studies that used treatment completer samples, so only people that completed treatment rather than an intention to treat sample, had a higher percentage difference in the number of people reconvicted for violence. And then samples that were judged to be at risk of bias, so samples that used matched groups rather than randomised control trials, were also associated with smaller effects. In fact, they were trivial when we did a subgroup analysis on just randomised control trials. When we looked at matched groups, we found quite a considerable effect, which was quite higher than the pooled effect at 20% difference. Okay, now what about sample characteristics? So there were pretty trivial differences associated with sample characteristics, by which I mean things like age and ethnicity. Part of that is because age, I don't think, varied very much between studies. There wasn't very much dispersion. And the other reason is something like ethnicity. We didn't really have the granularity in the data. We had to use the percentage of white people in the sample as our kind of proxy for ethnicity rather than particular cultural groups. Now, the trend associated with risk level of samples suggested a stronger treatment effect among high-risk samples. So when we used high-risk samples, the difference in the percentage of reoffending was far higher than when we used low or moderate risk samples or mixed risk samples, which is consistent with the risk needs, well, the risk principle from the risk needs responsivity model. Okay. And now what about treatment itself? Well, it probably doesn't come as much of a surprise, but we had larger reductions in violent offending for longer interventions. So you can see with our shortest intervention there, which was just 15 minutes, motivational interviewing intervention, the difference in reconviction rates was 3%, or reoffending rates was 3%. And the difference in, for our longest treatment duration for a study was 21%. So, and that tended to increase fairly linearly. There were more frequent sessions per week were also associated with greater differences between treatment and controls. So again, once you can see the studies with the least number of sessions, which was less than 1 per week, were associated with a treatment effect of 8% difference. Whereas the difference for those with the highest number of sessions, sorry, I should read highest number of sessions, that's 7 per week, was 21%. Also, interventions delivered in therapeutic community units, and it's a unit where the treated participants all live together and participate in treatment together, had a higher difference for the percent reconvicted for violence. Okay. Now, continuing on with the duration and nature of interventions, we had larger reductions in violent reoffending for multimodal and anger management programs. They were associated with larger differences in the percent reconvicted compared to standardised CBT, a standard CBT. And the trend for the trend also indicated that group-based interventions, including group-based interventions that included individual work, were associated with larger reductions in reoffending than individual interventions. Now, I forgot to mention this earlier, but I should mention that the effects that we looked at for our moderator analysis here, initially we set everything at a 0.05 level, and we found a number of significant effects, which I'm kind of showing you here. But we figured because we're making so many comparisons, we ought to correct for multiple comparisons there and readjust our alpha level. When we readjusted our alpha level, very few results were significant. In fact, we only found 2 significant moderator results. However, the trends that I'm showing you here are still, I think, of interest in spite of that. Okay, so what about intervention components? And here we did find significant results for relapse prevention and role play. So you find larger reductions in violent reoffending when relapse prevention, role play and homework were included, and also interpersonal effectiveness, which I haven't got up there. Interestingly, we also found an increase in effectiveness where basic life skills were not included in the study. A fairly similar pattern for non-violent reoffending. However, rather than relapse prevention, we found that emotional regulation had a trend towards being associated. Okay, we also looked at the cumulative effect of the number of treatment components included in the study. And again, we found that there was evidence of a cumulative effect, but it didn't turn out to be statistically significant, but the trend was certainly there. Okay, so to sum up, our review suggests that psychological interventions with violent offenders are most effective, or maybe most effective, keeping in mind the non-significant results, when they're intensive in nature. So by that I mean at least 250 hours of structured intervention, 3 to 4 sessions per week, delivered within a designated treatment therapeutic unit, delivered to high-risk offenders that incorporate group-based or group-based plus individual work, and are multi-targeted, incorporating relapse prevention, role-playing, homework activities, anger control, interpersonal skills, and interpersonal effectiveness. Okay, and now we move to the second part of our review, which focused on treatment targets. So here we had 22 independent studies, of which 18 made it into the actual meta-analysis due to missing data. Total sample of just under 2,000 offenders. So a lot of the samples were quite small. Average age, again, is early 30s. And once again, the treatment length did differ considerably between studies, and we had quite a bit of difference in terms of the types of interventions utilised. Okay, once again, forest plots. Okay, for trait anger and impulsivity, measured through self-report and observer-rated scales. Now, effects, once again, to the left of the midline are effects in favour of treatment. Effects to the right of the midline are effects in favour of control. So the pooled effect in favour for trait anger was significant and amounts to I suppose, a small change by conventional standards in standard deviation units. Impulsivity, similarly significant, with the difference amounting to a small effect. Okay. You'll notice here general social skill. We found very few studies that examined this, that met our criteria. And you'll also notice that quite a few studies are to the left of the midline. So I should mention that the scale used for this study was basically rated social skill in such a way that lower scores were indicative of better social skills. So it was the disruptive behaviour and problem scale. And here, probably not surprisingly, you find a non-significant effect because of the small number of studies, but it trends in the right direction. Similarly, we find a non-significant pooled effect for antisocial cognitions, and here that's just a mix of hostility, aggression, criminal attitudes and violent attitudes, with the difference of 0.19 standard deviation units relative to the control group. Okay, finally, I've got to move quickly. Problem solving. Treatment here was also effective. Effects here, though, are to the right of the midline, effects in favour of treatment. And here treatment's effective with an average difference that is kind of moderate by conventional standards at 0.39 standard deviations. So just to sum up, treatment appears to be effective in reducing trait anger and impulsivity and improving problem-solving skills. There's less certainty around the effect for general social skill and antisocial cognitions, but effects appear to be in the right direction. Overall, the secondary outcomes appear to generally follow the pattern that we'd expect if they were associated with reductions in primary outcomes, but there's a huge caveat here. So the study limitations really prevent us from investigating whether those changes in secondary outcomes are associated with reductions in recidivism at the individual study level. So a lot of the studies that we included didn't actually include both treatment targets and recidivism within the same study, which made it difficult to incorporate. We are basically looking at two different sets of studies here for the most part. Okay, study limitations. So we had a relatively small number of RCTs that were identified. I think 4 for violent reoffending and approximately the same number for our secondary outcomes. Few studies, at least for the primary outcomes, were conducted in forensic mental health settings, and for both our primary and secondary outcomes, very few studies were conducted in community settings. Another thing that we should point out is that the moderating effects that we found that were present, or the trends, obviously don't reflect causal relationships because they co-vary with a lot of other variables at the study level. Ultimately, what we need here is more studies in order to kind of incorporate multiple moderators into our moderator analysis. Obviously, another issue was reporting. So determining factors that impact treatment effect were restricted by the level of detail that was described in each study. So to give you an example, for the treatment components that we had, obviously not every study indicated that they didn't include relapse prevention. So if they didn't indicate that they didn't include relapse prevention, they were coded as a no. So that's just a limitation of coding studies for meta-analysis. And finally, the outcome measures we used, so particularly with recidivism, when we look at violent and general non-violent recidivism, it tended to be the proportion of individuals reoffending. Now, that's an interesting metric, but it's obviously not the only metric, and it only tells part of the story. If we had outcome measures such as frequency of reoffending and the severity or time to reoffending, that would make for I suppose, a more interesting analysis. Finally, I'm going to move to improving the effectiveness of treatments. So basically what we require to have a better understanding of the relationship between treatment and outcome are a few things. One is due to the relatively low number of well-designed studies, we need more of those. So we need more well-designed studies, RCTs, larger sample sizes in the area to make more definitive conclusions. We also need more hypothesis-driven research. So one limitation that I mentioned earlier with the secondary outcomes meta-analysis was that a lot of the studies, they either included secondary outcomes with no measure of recidivism, or they included recidivism with no measure of a secondary outcome. What you really want is the treatment target to be included within the study, so we can actually get a sense of how they're related to one another. And finally, once again, inclusion of different measures of recidivism, so time to recidivism, counts of offences, and so on. Okay, I think I've run well over time. Thank you.
We probably have time for just one short question if anyone's got a burning question. Just one question, just down here.
Sorry, quick question. Given just the different countries and settings you were looking at, were you able to look at whether the participants of these studies were voluntary or involuntary, well, not involuntary, but like they were kind of highly encouraged to do it, and whether the definition of reoffending varied, like whether it was just getting a court order or like just having a police report put in, or all the way going into custody?
We did code that as a data, as a extracted from the studies, so whether it was voluntary or mandatory. At that level, I think all but one was voluntary, and then within that level, all of them were there was still an element of coercion. So there wasn't, to put it simply, there wasn't enough variability to look at that as a moderator. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. The final presentation for this session is by Kyle Ott and Rachel Teacher from John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and their paper is Intimate Partner Violence and Data Science, a case study of enhancing IPV data and implementing an IPV-focused deterrent strategy.